Bob Sproul than I've learned from anybody else. Bob is quite amazing. He showed up when I was first teaching at Harvard. He was an undergraduate there. And he had graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy and gone to Harvard on a Westinghouse full tuition scholarship, having won the Westinghouse Science Talent Search. And he was clearly one of the brightest students that had ever walked across my threshold, and we started then what's turned out to be a lifetime association, for which I'm very thankful. And as I said before, Bob will be showing up shortly. He's going to give his part of this talk. We have kind of a repartee. I'm going to tell you how I thought it was, and he's going to tell you how it really was. Things happened in our computer room at Harvard late at night when the faculty wasn't there. And that's his part of the talk. My part of the talk is sort of the straight stuff, right? Now, I know you can't read the caveat at the bottom of this title sheet, and so I printed it again big in case there was any question of what it said. This lecture and all recordings of it are the property of the authors. Use of any portion of this material for profit-seeking purposes, including resale, rental for a fee, replay at events where admission is charged, or any use for broadcast or cable TV requires advance written permission from the authors. Okay, we got that over. Now, when you have a talk like this, you always have to acknowledge everybody in sight and thank them all for all the things they did. So I sat down with Bob and we sort of thought about who was it who contributed to this activity. Harvard supported me. Harvard University has a very interesting rule. They do not allow their faculty to take support on contracts at all. Harvard has a very large endowment, and it believes that the permanent faculty should be paid for out of endowment funds and not out of contract funds, which is a very wise maneuver because it says should contract money dry up, they're still able to continue paying their permanent faculty. Interesting place, Harvard. I'll tell you some more stories about them in a minute. Westinghouse, of course, supported Bob on a full tuition scholarship, and Bell Helicopter featured importantly in the early head-mounted display work. They had done some work in using head-mounted displays for helicopter pilots. I found out about that, and they were extremely helpful. I visited them in Fort Worth on a couple of occasions, and they provided some equipment and considerable help to us, so thanks to Bell Helicopter. Bell Laboratories gave a grant to Harvard of a few $1,000s every year, and we used that money for a couple of years. It actually purchased the piece of equipment which Gwen Bell now has in the Computer Museum, and you'll see a picture of it a little later. Now here's the most interesting one. I had been working in Washington for a couple of years beforehand and made some friends at the CIA, and you may recall that in the early 60s, the CIA got in considerable trouble because they had sponsored the Students for a Democratic Society and created some turmoil inside the borders of the United States, which they are not supposed to do. So they were looking for a very upstanding, very sensible place that they could put some research money in a totally unclassified, totally above-board way to kind of make up for the malfeasance that they'd been involved in a little while before. And, you know, being a reasonable fellow, I said, hey, money's money, let's take it. So I sent them a proposal, and they said yes in about a week and a half, and sent a check, you know, it was $80,000 as I remember, and we got to work on the project. Well, it wasn't too long after that before the students found out about this, and the Old Mole was the liberal rag in Boston at the time, and there was a splash in the Old Mole about Harvard taking this filthy CIA money. There was a big controversy about it, and so Dean Ford, who was the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the time, he organized a debate in the faculty, and he had 8 speakers. They got 15 minutes each, and he went against the taking of this money, for taking the money, against, for, against, and he saved the last slot for himself, and he was clearly for it. Well, now it speaks either to my naivete as a young associate professor then, or the eloquence of the Harvard faculty, that I changed my opinion on whether I should have taken this money 8 times. And Dean Ford won the day with the following argument. He said, the source of funds makes not the slightest difference whatsoever. The only thing that matters is the conditions of the grant. If you find $1,000 sitting on your doorstep with no strings attached, take it and enjoy it. Doesn't matter where it came from. It says Harvard, above all, should recognize this, since most of Harvard's endowment came from the triangle trade. Okay. The United States Air Force provided our PD-V1 computer, and MIT Lincoln Laboratory did some stuff on our acoustic head position sensor. This is the group that was involved, Bob and myself, and these people were kind of the core group. And I think it's evidence of the fact that graduate school is a place where people form long-time ties. Chuck Seitz was a graduate student who was working on the project with us, and Dan Cohen was also. They're now in business in Southern California, have been friends ever since that time. I'll show you a picture of Steve Koons later on. Steve Koons was an important part of our project and a very wonderful gentleman. Little history before we showed up at Harvard. I had done a PhD at MIT with a thesis called Sketchpad, which was the subject of an earlier lecture in this series. Then I went to the National Security Agency for a while, and then I was transferred to the Pentagon as a first lieutenant in the United States Army. It was rather a strange position because my boss was a civilian. He happened to be Bob Sproul's father, as a matter of fact, but I didn't know the Bob Sproul that'll be here this afternoon then. I only knew Bob Sproul Sr., his father, who was my boss. And when I went to work there, Bob Sproul Sr. and the Army had an argument over the press release. And the Army thought that they should announce that Lieutenant Sutherland went and took this post in Washington, and Bob Sproul thought that it should be Dr. Sutherland. And apparently this press release went back and forth half a dozen times and never did get released. And the problem, of course, was that there were 7 offices in ARPA at that time. And 2 of them were run by military people and the other 5 by civilians. Civilians were no problem. But the other military fellow who ran one of the offices was Major General Winnicke. And so General Winnicke and I used to go to staff meetings, and we used to sit beside each other. He always wore his uniform. I never wore mine. And he always called me Ivan, and I always called him Sir. And we got along just fine. I don't think he knew I was in the service at all. And boy, I sure wasn't going to tell him. So anyhow, I got out of the service, stayed on as a civilian for a while, and then went to Harvard in 1966. And Bob, of course, had graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy, had been at Harvard a little longer than I had, and I met him in 1966 when I got there. Now, the idea for the head-mounted display, which is what we called it at that time, came through some work that the Bell Helicopter Company had done for night vision helicopter pilots. The problem was a helicopter pilot wants to land in the clearing at night, and he has to somehow keep clear of the trees around the edge of the field. And so they thought, we'll give him an infrared camera to look through so that he could see all of these trees and stuff and land quite successfully. And in those days, the infrared camera equipment was quite large and bulky. And so their plan was to mount it on the bottom of the helicopter and then slave the position of the camera to the position of the pilot's head and mount some goggles on the pilot's head that would transmit a cathode ray tube image of whatever the infrared camera saw to the pilot, so he would then see what the camera saw. And I heard about this, and I heard about 2 key experiments that they did. And the 2 key experiments were kind of interesting. They mounted just a regular video camera on the roof of their building, and they put a person with the goggles on somewhere inside the building. And then they had 2 people on the roof playing catch, and they were playing catch with a tennis ball. And this fellow would watch the tennis ball go back and forth, turning his head to keep the tennis ball in view of the video camera. And he was quite comfortable with the notion that he was able to watch this game of catch. And then one of the players threw the ball at the camera, and the guy inside the building ducked, okay, which was pretty clear evidence that he had identified his position as being at the location of the camera rather than safely ensconced in the room that he was in. And then they did one other thing to him. They said, well, why don't you look down? Which he did. And unbeknownst to him, they had actually mounted the camera about 3 feet out on a board over the edge of the 4-story building. So when he looked down, there was nothing underneath, and apparently he got quite a substantial shock. Again, evidence that he identified his location as that of the camera. rather than the location of himself. And I had heard about these two experiments and made the leap of faith that said, why do we have to have a real image from a real camera? Why can't we simply compute an image and display a computed image, changing the computed image in the same way that the video camera changes the real image, and thereby immerse an individual in a synthetic environment? And so I went to Harvard with the notion that this was a project that we could use to work on. It was a project that was difficult but not impossible. It was certainly easy to understand what the objective was. The objective was to let an observer immerse himself inside a computed image. And the important thing was that we could measure head position. We did not have to measure eye position. Measuring eye position is very difficult. Measuring head position is pretty easy. You can fasten some kind of helmet on the head and measure that position. It's harder to fasten things to your eyeballs. So what did we need to complete this project? We needed basically four things. We needed a head position sensor of some kind so the computer could know which direction the guy's head was facing, whether it was up, down, sideways, or tilted. And we needed some kind of a database. Well, as you'll see, we didn't need very much of that because the equipment was pretty crude in those days. We kind of put that one off. We needed some display generation equipment to produce the three-dimensional perspective images quickly enough so that the observer would get the impression that those images were around him. And we needed some kind of a CRT display device to display the images on. Well, the first display device that we had came from Bell Helicopter. It was a single-eye device which had a little reflecting mirror and a small CRT, and it was rather crude, had a very narrow field of view, and we fairly soon abandoned that for a thing that we purchased from Perkin-Elmer Company, which was this head-mounted display device. It has two CRTs mounted in these cylinders at the back with the wires coming out in the back. And then there's a lens arrangement, and the thing in front of the user's eyes is a half-silvered mirror embedded in a prism. So he sees superimposed on the world around him, he sees the cathode ray tube images. It provided images to both eyes. It was nicely adjustable. And as you can see, it's spread out quite a bit behind him because it was intended originally for use with a pilot with an APH-5 helmet on, and the CRTs were intended to clear the helmet. And we simply purchased the third one of these. Bell Helicopter had purchased two of them from Perkin-Elmer and paid for the initial development cost, and we bought another one from Perkin-Elmer at the incremental cost of buying another piece. So the overall system block diagram that we ended up with looks like this. And what you can see is we have some kind of a head position measuring device which feeds head positions to a computer that then figures out what to say to a matrix multiplier that does the rotation transformation. And that passes information to some kind of a clipping device which does the perspective transformation. I'll say quite a bit more about that in a little while. And that passes information to some kind of an analog display driver, which then displays the information on the CRT. And I said earlier that we put off the database problem for a while. I'll show you the most complicated image we ever saw through this device. Now, if you look carefully at this image, you'll find that the letters N, S, W, and E are not in the planes of the four sides of the cube. As I remember, this cube is in fact 6 inches in size, and the letters are staggered in a half an inch. And so one of the things that we would ask an observer to do is line yourself up with the edges of one of these cubes and look at the letter edge on and tell us how far inside the cube it is. And sure enough, observers could easily enough move their head to the right position to get an edge-on view of one of the edges of the cube and observe that the letter was slightly inside. Here you can see a little more clearly that the W is inside the edge of the cube. Well, so that was the equipment we needed, and we had a computer. By some magic, which I never quite understood, Harvey Brooks, who was the dean at that time, managed to talk the Air Force out of this PDP-1 computer. And it was an enormous PDP-1 computer. It may have been the biggest PDP-1 ever bought. I don't know. It had been in some Air Force laboratory not being used very much when Harvey Brooks talked them out of it. It came to Harvard after I'd been there 6 months or so. We put it in the basement of Cruft Laboratory. It was right on the same level as the ground, and when it rained, we used to have to sweep the water out to try and keep the computer from drowning. It had 24,000 words of 18-bit memory for a total of about 48 kilobytes. Put this thing in context, it was 5 microsecond memory, which gives it about 0.1 MIPS of computing power. It had fan-fold paper tape. And at one point, a sign appeared which said, "If there are computers in hell, they will use paper tape." Paper tape is not a pleasant medium for any of you who've had to use it. It produces chad, for one thing, and it's slow, and glad it's gone. So then it had some deck tape and some other things on it. It had 3 displays, and I guess I've got a picture of those that I'll show in just a minute. We had people. The most exciting thing about Harvard was there was this wonderful collection of people. And there were people from all around who came to make use of the PDP-1. And here's a list that Bob and I sat down and produced just from memory to remember kind of people who had been there. I'll mention a few of these. J.C.R. Licklider made use of our machine. He's the man who coined the phrase man-machine symbiosis. Was one of the very early time-sharing people and an absolutely wonderful man. He did a great many wonderful things for a great many people. William Newman came as a postdoc for Harvard and worked in our group, and he and Bob subsequently wrote the computer graphics text, which I know as Newman and Sproul. It actually has a title, but who knows the title and who cares, right? Let's see who else was there. Todd Whipke was a chemist who came to make use of the PDP-1 to look at chemical molecules, one of the very early visualization of chemistry activities that went on. D.D. Pei was an interesting case. I gave this computer graphics course, and I insisted that each of the students come in and talk to me beforehand to make sure they had enough prerequisites and so on. And this guy came in, D.D. Pei, and he said, he's a physics major, he wanted to take my computer graphics course, and I said, well, why are you interested in computer graphics? He says, well, I want to do a little architecture, and I said, well, how come you're interested in architecture? And he says, well, my father's an architect. Some other people you might know, Ben Wegbright is here in the area. He was one of the founders of Stardent. Computer is now, I think, working for Hambrick and Quist, although he may have gone on to the next thing beyond that. So anyhow, these are a few of the people that were around at that time and that we had a wonderful time with. I think at this point I'm going to turn this guy out and raise the screen. I have a few pictures of some of these people. This is the late Steve Koons. Steve Koons was one of my thesis committee and was a mechanical engineer who was the person who introduced us to projective geometry and the use of homogeneous coordinates. And it was Steve whose continuous sort of emphasis on good mathematics, I think, led to the view of the matrix multiplication as a way of compounding rotations to make the whole job understandable and easy. Let's see who else is on this collection of things here. This is the back of Chuck Seitz' head. Now this is the equipment that we built. We'll be talking about that a little later. There were 3 racks, as I recall, of equipment to do the computations that we needed to do. Here's a picture of 2 of the scopes on the PDP-1. There were 3 scopes like this. This is Ted Lee, who was my teaching assistant. And you see here a curve. We began to experiment with the use of homogeneous coordinates to produce various curves that you can produce from basic conic sections. There was some quite interesting work done on the issue of representing curves at that time. Here's Harry Lewis. Harry Lewis was a classmate of Bob's, was a junior when I first met him and a senior. I remember reading Harry Lewis's thesis, senior thesis at Harvard, and on the last page I found the abstract. He had put an abstract on which said something of the effect, if you read this thesis, you will find out something or other. I forget exactly what it was. And on the last page, he told you what the answer was. And I take the position that the abstract of any document is there to let you avoid reading it if you wish. And so the answer ought to be in the abstract. So Harry had to move his answer into the front of his thesis before I'd let it go through. Harry is now the dean of Harvard College. Now, we had kind of an interesting scheme for allocating PDB-1 time. PDB-1 was a precious resource, and like all computers, it didn't wear out if you used it. In fact, it was rather better to leave it running. And there were a lot of people who wanted to use it, and the problem was, how do we allocate time on it? And so we used a scheme that I called the yen system. It was a continuous auction. And the idea was that you had a certain number of yen, which were reservation tokens for future computer time. And there was a scheduling board, of which this is a picture, on which you could reserve time in the future. And so, for example, here's each day is represented here. And you can see some places where there's been some bidding done, and then some of these days have a black line drawn over them, which was the indication that the bidding is frozen. 8 o'clock every morning when my secretary came in, she would go down to the computer room and freeze the time for the next day. But up until the schedule was frozen, you could outbid anybody who had bid for time. So if you wanted time from 2 to 4 and somebody had put 3 yen on the time from 2 to 4, which is a yen and a half an hour, and you had 4 yen of reservation tokens, you could say, I'll have that time, please, and I'll bid 4 yen for it. And so the price of computer time in yen was controlled by whatever the market wanted it to be. And that turned out to work very well at undesirable hours, like 9 o'clock in the morning. Computer time was very cheap. At desirable hours, like 1 a.m., computer time might be quite expensive. And the price of computer time just at the end of the term went up quite a bit. And the price, during holidays and so on. There was always the problem of the hour between 2 and 3 a.m. in the spring. Okay, there is an hour between 2 and 3 a.m. in the spring which doesn't exist. Okay, and it routinely got signed up for by God. Let's see what else I can tell you. Yen were not spendable. They were reservation tokens. So when you used the time, you got them back. And that was the important feature of this auction, which is you didn't have so many yen per month. You had so many yen, period. And that meant that the amount of future time that you could have reserved on the schedule was controlled by your purchasing power rather than the total amount of time that you used. Now, the result of that was that this PDB-1 was used round the clock, 7 days a week. And at undesirable times, the price got very cheap, and a person with 1 yen could come in when nobody else wanted the machine and just use it. The Air Force insisted that I report utilization. So every week I sent them a report saying, another week of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. After I'd done this 4 or 5 weeks, I got a call from Major so-and-so who said, now, Dr. Sutherland, he says, it's not necessary to falsify these records. He said, we used this machine for years and years, and it was, ran one shift, and that'd be perfectly satisfactory. We're happy with that. And I said, I'm not falsifying the records. That's what we're getting out of it. So here's a little closer view of that scheduling board. You can see here the freezing of the schedule, and you can see different people's initials with arrows and how they've, changed. No overbidding, Pat. Dr. Gagliardi. Gagliardi had a demo or something going on, and so you could put notes on the board. And people were pretty good about cooperating, especially with the faculty. There were problems with the There were problems with the head-mounted display equipment that we got. The first version from Bell Helicopter, the one-eyed thing, was very limited field of view. The second one we had some problems with. It was heavy. It had, as I recall, a 25 or 30 degree field of view, which wasn't enough. It gave you a feeling of tunnel vision. It was monochrome, of course, and in those days the notion of a raster display had yet to be invented, and so it was a calligraphic or a line drawing display. So the images that we showed were transparent wireframe images and consequently not very realistic. Now let me turn my attention to the head position sensor. We built two of these. The first one we called the shower stall. It was an ultrasonic device. It had 4 receivers in the ceiling, and it had, and here they are. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them on that 4-bladed thing, and there were 3 transmitters mounted on the head-mounted display device. The 3 transmitters transmitted at a different frequency each, and there was a rack of equipment that then sensed the phase of the received signals in the 4 receivers. As I recall, the wavelength was ½ an inch or something, and we could then count changes in phase and figure out the position of the head. It wasn't a very satisfactory arrangement. For one thing, the speed of sound is 1,000 feet per second, and the speed of currents in an ordinary, air currents in an ordinary office is 2 or 3 feet per second, and so the accuracy of the ultrasonic device was limited by the flow of air in the room, and if the air conditioner came on and blew air around, the head position sensing would wobble. We also built a mechanical head position sensor that we called the Sword of Damocles. And the Sword of Damocles had a pair of concentric tubes so it could extend, and there was a universal joint at the top and a universal joint at the bottom. There was a pivot, I think, at the bottom so the head could turn as well. So turning is 1, then 2 degrees of freedom in the lower universal joint, total 3. Length is 4. 2 more in the upper joint is 5 and 6. 6 degrees of freedom altogether, which is what you need to have full motion for a head position. I remember Danny Cohen trying to debug the computer program that figured out head position from the 6 measurements. And Danny was a great debugger. He liked to just write the program any old way and then debug it into working. Okay? Now he had 6 matrices to multiply together, and they could have been in either order, and they could have been transposed each. Okay, so that's 12, 6 for order and 2 for here. So he had at least 4,000 debugging possibilities to try before he had a hope of success. And I remember sitting down with him and saying, Danny, now what you got to do is work out the right answer. Instead, this is not one that you're going to debug into working. You got to figure out how to do the mathematics and get it right ab initio, and he did finally get it correct. This device had a number of failings. I think you can probably read those. I don't think I need to go into them. Well, what was the computation that we needed? We needed perspective images. We needed them to be stationary in space as the person moved his head, and so we needed to change the image on the CRT according to the head position. So we had to be able to rotate and translate the images in space, and then we had to compute the perspective projection so that the person would see a proper perspective. Now, folk had done perspective projections before, but they had always presumed that the material that was to be projected would be entirely on the screen. And of course the problem is, with the head-mounted display, that you had a field of view, a limited field of view, which was defined by the equipment. And then if you had a line that you were going to display, a 3-dimensional line that you were going to display on this limited field of view, only part of the line might appear on the screen. The other parts would be gone. And there's another problem, of course, is there might be material behind you. And if you just do the ordinary perspective projection, it doesn't care whether the perspective comes from the front or the back. The mathematics will divide a negative number by a negative number and get a positive result. And so there's a nonlinear thing you have to do to get rid of the stuff behind you as well. And so we had to invent 3-dimensional clipping. Nobody'd done that before. And the notion was that there would be a window and there'd be some lines. There were basically 3 cases. both ends of the line might be outside the window, which didn't mean that the line disappeared. Or you could have both ends inside the window, or one end in and one end out. And so how are we going to do clipping? What we actually did was, in essence, to compute the midpoint of the line and ask the question, for each half of this line, does any part of this half show? In the particular case that I've drawn here, once you've computed the midpoint of this line, it's easy to see that both ends of one half are too far to the right, and both ends of the other half are too low. And so neither half could possibly be on the screen, so we can throw that out. And so we built a device which essentially did this kind of logarithmic search. We called it a clipping divider. It did the clipping activity. This is a block diagram of the clipping divider. It had some shifting registers. It did four arithmetic operations at once in each of two units. One unit dealt with one end of the line and the other dealt with the other end of the line. And the lower registers in each group here shifted to the right in order to make the numbers half size each time. So that was kind of a logarithmic search going on. And that was the original clipping divider. It also did a division and a multiplication concurrently. The same equipment later on did the perspective. That was the clipping part. Then it did the perspective division part, and also multiplied by a scale factor simultaneously. So half of this equipment for each of these units, half of the equipment was doing a division, generating the bits of the quotient, which were immediately used in the other half as a multiplicand to do a concurrent multiplication. And that was one of the main activities that we had, was building this clipping divider, turned into Bob's bachelor's thesis, and I think he may have a little more to say about it later on. He'll tell you the real story about how it got to work. So we had a display pipeline, had matrix multiplier, clipping divider, and then the analog line generator. And this equipment was all synchronous boxes, asynchronously connected. Chuck Seitz had been interested in asynchronous systems since he had picked it up from some folk at MIT that were interested in it. He taught us how to do that. And so the original clipping divider, in fact, had a stoppable clock in each of the major units. So each of the major units was internally synchronous, but they communicated in a totally asynchronous way, and if one of them got into a wait state, it would come out of that wait state whenever the other one told it to come out, not necessarily waiting for the next clock tick. The next clock tick just started at the time that was needed. Integrated circuits had already been invented, and we in fact used them. We could get 4 2-input NAND gates in one massive integrated circuit. Came in a convenient 14-pin package. I think you can still buy them at Fry's. They're 19 cents now. At that time, they were about $5, if I recall. And we had about 3 integrated circuits mounted on a little printed circuit card, which then plugged into a back panel about that size. And as I recall, we made equipment that had 6 or 7 of those panels wired up with wire wrap wiring in the back. So there were small boards with wire wrap. Most important design aid we had was a plastic template for drawing logic diagrams. And Bob looked through his archives, and we have with us here some of the original drawings for the clipping divider. These are dated 1968, but here's a set of the drawings that we made. You can look at these afterwards if you're interested. Okay. Now I guess it's time for Bob.
Greetings. Well, Ivan's really told you about how it works. I'm not. That's not my role here. You know, I was the student, you see, and so my job tonight is to give you a slightly different perspective on this whole thing, and I'll just sort of tell you a little story about how I got involved in all this. People often sometimes ask me why I'm in the computing business, and I say it's because I took my camera to physics class one Saturday morning when I was a freshman, and everything stemmed from that. It turns out somebody came up to me, a Chinese guy, the same one that Ivan mentioned, Didi Pei, and said, why did you take pictures? And I said, well, I don't know. Well, I was going to the football game this afternoon. I thought I'd take my camera along. He said, well, you really ought to join the yearbook, take pictures for the yearbook. So I did that and met a guy who was interested in business data processing and had figured out how to get access to one of the 1401s on campus. And so we computerized all the business records of the yearbook, including dunning parents, something I'm sure you all recognize as an important yearbook activity. And so I had a glorious time spending a lot of my time on the yearbook. In fact, in senior year, I was managing editor, which we'll come to in a moment. But an interesting thing happened in the spring of 1967. At Harvard, every year they published, of course, a course catalog, and you were supposed to sit and studiously figure out what to take from the course catalog. But the really interesting stuff never made it into the course catalog. It got posted on bulletin boards a few days before the term started. So the game always was to go around and find the really exciting things and sit in on the courses for a while and sort of dawdle, watch, and select the most exciting thing to do that term. So one of Dee Dee's roommates actually discovered this posting of a new associate professor in applied math, a guy named Sutherland, admission by consent of instructor. So we all traipsed over and got interviewed by Ivan, and Ivan described, in fact, Dee Dee's interview. And we, of course, you understand, Harvard students aren't really cowed by interviews with professors, so we went and did all this forthright, and we're actually somewhat surprised to get into the class. So the class was AM 252R, as I recall. The R stood for the fact that you could take it again if you wanted to. It wasn't because you failed, it's because next time it was likely to be something different. And Ivan was very good about preparing course notes. It met once a week, and there was a course lecture period, and then the actual takers of the course would migrate upstairs into sort of the inner sanctum afterwards, and that would be where the actual, the smaller group would meet and would talk about projects and questions and so on. The lectures were very well attended. Filled the room, probably about half the number of people that are here, half the number of seats actually, which was the full room. And the various strange people would come. One of the strangest was a guy that none of us could understand. And he would ask questions. He was very bright, clearly had known a lot about this stuff. And Ivan very conscientiously made an effort to understand the questions of this guy and respond carefully. And this turned out to be Danny Cohen, who later joined the project and made very important contributions to it. I remember guest lectures. The most interesting one was by Tom Stockham, who was at Lincoln at the time, and came and talked about light pen tracking and how you built the right kind of control system to do predictive tracking of the light pen. It actually got me kind of interested in light pen tracking, and one of the things I did as a project for the course was to build a light pen tracker that would not only figure out where the pen was, but what twist you had put on it by putting up a non-symmetric tracking pattern. Well, Ivan has already described the PDP-1, and of course this was the shiny object. I suppose if you asked the question, why did we all really want to join this course, it was because there was a PDP-1 offered as part of it. It was, of course, a single user machine in the best sense of the word, which means there were switches on it that you got to toggle and push the boot button and so on. I suppose with personal computers today that isn't so exciting, but boy, at the time that was something. The whole machine was there for you to look at, and quite frankly, the thing that I got the most out of here was I had never really used a real computer or really understood how they work. Being the son of a physicist, a solid-state physicist at that, I had learned electronics, but I had no idea what the link between electronics and computing was, if you can believe that. But here was this PDP-10 with all this, PDP-1, excuse me, with all this wiring there to go and inspect. And moreover, in the corner was this marvelous rack that had prints of how the PDP-1 was put together. And you could pull out the modules and look at the circuits and so on and so forth. And by looking at these things, I suddenly figured out that really computing was pretty simple. It was actually simpler than building transistorized amplifiers. And so the link between electronics that I knew a little bit about and computing that was still a mystery was solved right there. And then, as Ivan pointed out, the place was full of interesting people doing interesting projects. So although I actually had never really had much in the way of a programming course, I learned all I needed to know and more from the various people who were doing things. One of the most unsung heroes was a man by the name of John Goodenough. I don't know where he came from or how Ivan inveigled him to do this, but he actually was was the system programmer. He maintained the compiler.
I think he had worked at the Air Force on this machine.
He came with the machine.
I
That
think
would
he
make
came with
sense. He probably had an office in the machine, actually. And he had this well under control. You know, he would come in very studiously with paper clips, put in all the listings in just the right places. He'd make all the changes. He'd recompile and rebuild the system and walk away and leave a working system. And I was really impressed. And he obviously made a big difference. Well, the research project was, in a way, an outgrowth of the course. I think Ivan did what all faculty members do, which is he uses the course as kind of a proving ground for students and figuring out which ones he wants to try to suck in for more work. So, well, toward the end of the spring course, he invited me to spend the summer. And of course, undergraduates are always looking for summer jobs. And this looked like the great summer job. I got to stay in Cambridge. It probably wasn't going to be much different than playing on the PDP-1 already was. And so I didn't have a clue what we'd be doing, but it was great. So what it turned out we did most of that summer, I think, was to work on some of the algorithms and so on. Danny Cohen, Ivan hadn't mentioned, but Danny had worked for Key Data. What was it called? It was called something else before that. As a consultant, and had actually done a bunch of geometric processing, not dissimilar from clipping. And so he and Ivan principally huddled and worked out a lot of the clipping stuff. And as I recall, I kibitzed. But at some point, I think it was in the early fall, we got down to serious construction and TTL design and so forth. And as I said, this TTL seemed awfully simple stuff. So Ivan said there were these little cards from Monitor Systems, as I recall. All the pins from the chips came straight out to pins on the back panel, and those were what you wired up. So what we had to build for this clipper was a kind of giant data path. It turned out to be a bit slice data path with ones complement arithmetic, which turns out was something that tripped us up in a couple of places. I think I'm very grateful that one's complement has died. I didn't know much about how you design machines. By the way, we didn't have really RAM and ROM, so the obvious sort of way we do state machines today wasn't the way to do it with these little chips. And so what we finally hit on was using what's called a one-hot design, where you had a flip-flop, a rank of flip-flops, only one of which was on. And that was the one that was lit up was the state you were in. And what you did is you built set and reset conditions to go from one state to the next. And you can guess the obvious failure mode. Either you had two lights lit up or none. And so there was always that problem. But Chuck was actually a very solicitous teacher. He would sort of smile benignly at the stuff that we were doing a little bit wrong but didn't matter. And the really tense parts of the design he would simply do. So that's how it basically all worked in the end. So we started building this thing. Quint Foster did a net listing program, which I had never seen a net listing program before. You know, it was this giant sort thing and printed out reams and reams of paper. But turned out to be a lifesaver in actually constructing the thing. And the actual cages, the racks that held, 20 cards or so by a rack about yay high, we sent out to a Gardner Denver mechanical wrapping machine with Quint's net list to do the wrapping. And then the rack wiring, the wiring between cages, was done by slaves, people like me. And in fact, I recall that a lot of the most productive wrapping that I did was in the middle of the night in an alcohol-impaired state after some party. But I took the attitude that this was fine. If I made mistakes, I was the guy who had to pull them out of there and find them, so might as well. So the one thing I remember learning from all this is that because of the bit slice design, a lot of the control signals ran vertically across these cages, and they sort of turned into long linear transformers. And a lot of the marginal aspects of this design could be traced to these nests of closely packed wires. By contrast, the mechanically wrapped cages, you may recall from wire wrapping, deliberately chose routes so as not to make wires lay close to one another over long distances. And we weren't smart enough to do that when we wired up the cages together. So the debugging was actually a fair amount of fun. We had a simulator, of course, that was intended to be a bit-for-bit copy of what we were doing in the hardware. And so you single-step the simulator and you'd look at the lights. And so we hadn't built an umbilical cord to be able to digitally read back the state of anything. Good Lord, that would have taken all kinds of multiplexers and stuff and more stuff to wire wrap. So instead we just had light banks that we looked at to see whether the values were right. But the lovely thing about errors in the final analysis was that if it produced the wrong answer, you saw the wrong result on the display, and it was pretty obvious when a glitch happened. The line would suddenly bounce to a different position. Bear in mind, as Ivan said, this was a calligraphic display, so to keep the display running, you had to keep supplying the data, reclipping it again, sending it to the analog generator. It would generate the line, of course, in a sort of flash on the screen and go away. So do it again and again and again. So it was in a giant loop. So if there was any marginal behavior of the hardware, you would see these flashes from the correct value to the wrong value and so on. And like all graphics, the glitches, the bugs were very visible. And that's one of the things actually that I've always found very nice about graphics programs is you know when they're working. Well, in thinking back on this, it was a very short period of time. We got an awful lot done. In addition to, as Ivan said, this was my senior thesis, and I also was editor of the yearbook that year. So it was this typical situation where students and collections of students don't know that things are hard and can be encouraged to put a lot of work in. So the main thing that I remember about it was we learned an incredible amount in a way that didn't have anything to do with courses in formal education. It had to do with getting your hands dirty and dealing with the artifacts, which on a project that somehow was just achievable enough for us to stay motivated and active. I don't know if you mentioned the display file, but there's a sort of habit, a style of work arose in this group of writing things down. Memos and things, not all that formal, but short pieces to try to describe things to all members of the group, could be photocopied and handed out, and they were collected in a serial, chronological file that Ivan kept. And this became known in a punning way as the display file. And not only did this provide a nice record of things that we had done, but it was a way to educate new people who came to work in the group and so on. And by the way, these things weren't necessarily right. They simply were trying to write down our understanding of the time. And this is a way of working that Ivan and I have used ever since. We've tried sometimes vainly to get other people as excited about this mode of operating as we are. But I certainly have found it very, very, very useful. But really, looking back on it, the thing that struck me the most is this was this incredibly heterogeneous sort of off-the-wall group of quite different people doing things that in some sense they had no business doing, certainly had no training to do. And Ivan was essentially supremely confident that somehow we could pull all this off, and it kind of kept us all going. Maybe that's generally the way professors are able to inspire students. I don't know, but to me it was really revolutionary. So I'm about to hand it back to Ivan, but before I do, I just want to mention one thing. Ivan described the yen system in some detail. He left out an important point that you may have noticed, and you can probably guess the answer. Who assigned the yen tokens to people?
Will the person who did that please stand up? One of the nice things about the yen tokens was it was self-normalizing. So I didn't have to worry about how many total yen were outstanding. Because if I printed more yen, it was like printing more money, and the price of computer time would go up a little bit. It had inflation, right? And so it's self-normalizing. My rules were very simple. Anybody who had a half plausible reason for being there could get a yen. And I had 10. And other folks sort of fit in that spectrum somewhere. Well, I think it's time to provide a little look back at this project and try and answer some questions about, was this project worthwhile? Was it a success? Was it a failure? And I tried to write down here some arguments that one could make about this project as a failure. In fact, it didn't work very well. I mean, I gave you some evidence of that before, right? Here's this marvelously complex image that we were able to display. No one was fooled into thinking that the computer-generated images were real. For one thing, they weren't quite fast enough. When you moved your head, there were various phenomena that made the image break up, or it would stay the same image and then it would change later. And the head position sensors weren't very good. They had some, hysteresis in them. When you turned one way, they'd measure one thing. When you turned the other way, they'd measure something a little different. So that would cause the image to jump a little bit. Nobody was fooled. On the other hand, we did demonstrate that people could observe where they were in a synthetic world. And they could align themselves very easily using skills that they learned when they were 2 years old. to get their eye in the right place to see the view that they wanted to see. And in that sense, it was a successful demonstration that a head-mounted device could, in fact, be used as a display and give a person a sense of three-dimensionality. But I think the project was a success for quite a different reason. My friend Wes Clark speaks of an attention focuser. This was a wonderful attention focuser. We had this target out there, and the target was plausible. It was plausible. You might be able to see this computer-generated world, and you might compute it fast enough so you could see some interesting things, chemical molecules, architectural structures. I mean, you could, wax eloquent about the things, the possibilities. So it was perfectly plausible. And so, sponsors were willing to put money in, and students were willing to come around and work on it, and it kept the interest of the group going. But it was tough. The computer wasn't anywhere near fast enough to do the required computations, so we had to build this special equipment. And to build this special equipment, we had to think carefully about what were the graphics algorithms that we wanted to embody in this special equipment. And I think that focus of attention that the project provided made it the source of a whole bunch of research problems that were interesting problems in their own right. And I think that project kind of set the tone. We used homogeneous coordinates. That became kind of the standard way that people did three-dimensional stuff for a good period of time in the future. And we recognized that we wanted better images. We wanted images that looked solid. And the hidden surface problem at that time, to make images that were solid instead of transparent, these wireframe transparent things. That hidden surface problem, of course, required that you figured out what was in front of what and compute what's hidden and then leave it out. And that was far too hard for our little equipment to do, or even for our understanding of algorithms to do. But it was clear that that was an important problem. And if we could only do that, maybe we could make the images that we saw in the head-mounted display more realistic, and that would be, a good goal to shoot for. And so it provided a set of problems to think about and a set of tasks to work. And the first applications, of course, of the three-dimensional computer graphics to practical problems came in pilot training. Initially, the pilot training displays that were sold commercially were night only, so they displayed only the lights of the city and the lights on the runway and so on, and pilots had to imagine the other things that were there. But the FAA approved those night-only displays for real pilot training. And so a great many night-only displays were sold and put into service to train pilots for airlines all over the world. And it was only later that the hidden surface work became good enough that images in color of runways with tire marks on them and trees with leaves shimmering and so on, that all the kind of graphics that we see today and kind of are comfortable with today came into use. I think one of the important things to look at in research tasks is to find something that will be an attention focuser. Find something that is a target that you can shoot at, knowing full well that maybe the target is too far away to reach, but along the way you'll discover things and learn things that are important to the advance of technology. I kind of think there's sort of two kinds of research targets. I admire a great deal the folk in the medical world who said, I want a polio vaccine. And they devote 20 years of their life to learning how to make it. And those people get given a Nobel Prize, and they set up their own research institute in the beach in La Jolla, a beautiful place, by the way. And then they, that's a success. They know when they've succeeded. There's a different kind of research project, and I think the virtual reality is one of those, where there's a target, and there's no way you're going to reach it. Nobody's reached the virtual reality target yet. Nobody is fooled into thinking that the image they see through a computerized set of goggles is real. In spite of all the best computing that we have, it still has a cartoon-like quality, and the response time is not good enough yet, and so on. And so virtual reality is still providing a sort of a holy grail, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, a reason to explore for the Northwest Passage, a reason to go forward and push the technology as hard as you can in some direction. And you know full well that as you do that pushing on technology, you'll develop all kinds of things that are interesting and valuable in their own right. And the spin-offs from that kind of a pursuit are its real value. And I think in that sense, the head-mounted display was a very successful project. It was successful in another way that I think is important, and that's in the human way. There were friendships made at Harvard that last to this day, many of them. The folk that were there, that worked together, that got to know each other together, were at a stage in their lives where they were beginning to form adult friendships for the first time and develop those friendships, and they have lasted. I mentioned Chuck and Danny are in business together in Southern California. And these people who've worked together are just people who know each other and carry on together. Several of the group who were at Harvard went with me to Salt Lake City and were the founders of the Evans and Sutherland Company, and we carried forward some of this work in a commercial environment for the next many years. And it was successful in the sense that the technology spin-off provided the basis for a commercial enterprise. And another way that it was successful, I think, was in the education that it provided. There was a focus of attention that provided a way to teach folk, or to let folk learn, I think, to let folk learn about technology and about the practice of technology, and to let them sort of share and enjoy the excitement of what it is to do something that no one's ever done before. It's really exciting to do things that no one's ever done before. I guess I have to end up with a little incident that happened. Went to a lecture at Caltech. It was one of the lectures kind of like this. It was a public lecture by one of the Caltech professors. He happened to be a physicist, and this lecture was on the subject of quarks. And he told us all about strange quarks and upside-down quarks, and they have peculiar names, quarks. I don't understand them, but never mind. It was a fascinating lecture, and at the end he said, this exploration is really exciting. He feels like the exploration of his brand of science, as I feel my brand of technology, the exploration is very exciting. And he put a slide up on the screen in which he showed the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria. And he said he felt rather like the old explorers exploring, the world and having this adventure going across the ocean and so on. I couldn't resist. The next day I sent him a little note and I said, "Is it true that 4 quarks make 1 galleon?" I didn't get an answer back. Here are some references. I know you can't read them. I want to hold up one. This is a book on virtual reality which showed up on my desk from unknown sources, and I flipped through this. I find my name is sort of splattered through it. How can you complain about a book that has your name in it a lot? So anyhow, you can have a look at this if you want. And we have these drawings if you want to look at that, and Bob and I will be around, be happy to answer questions. Thanks. I have a few copies of these slides if anybody urgently wants a copy of the slides. I have some. Questions? Who was there at the time? Any folk who were around at that time, Les Ernest, you better put your hand up. I got to tell you another story, a PDB-1 story. Since Bert put his hand up, this is my brother Bert. And at the time this was all going on, Bert was a pilot in the Navy. He has 104, is that right, 108 successful carrier landings. Bert, how do you know that it's successful? Ta-da! Anyhow, Danny Cohen wrote a little airplane simulator. He had some mountains, which were just diagonal lines like this around the screen. He had a runway, which was a rectangle like this. He had switches that you could fly the airplane with. And I used to fly the airplane. I'd always crash. I'd crash off to the side, and the bell on the teletype would start ringing. Go ding, 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 ding. Danny, what's that? Oh, that's the ambulance. So Bert came up for a visit. He sat down and, no problem, landed the airplane right in the middle of the runway. Must be something to that pilot training stuff. And then he complained to Danny. He says, this isn't a real airplane. And Danny hadn't done the physics of the airplane right. And Bert was able to detect that and said, this isn't a real airplane. Well, subsequently, Danny's become a pilot and he's done lots better simulators. Who else was there? Les, you were there.
Yeah.
Did you visit us in the PDB-1?
Not in Harvard, just in Utah.
I have to wear your hat.
Is that right? Yeah, the helmet, this helmet device, the head-mounted display device went to Utah, the University of Utah. and was used for a couple of PhD theses there. They subsequently looked, I remember looking at a U.S. map that somebody had entered in a database of U.S. map. It was terrific. It had Maine on the right and California on the left, and all the states were outlined. And it was pretty impressive, actually, and that was great until I went around and got the edge view. And as I had always suspected, the world is quite flat.
The thing that made me nervous was the 3,000 volts on the CO2.
A feature. Question in the back?
Why did you choose Salt Lake City to go to when you left Cambridge?
Why did I choose Salt Lake City to go to? Well, Dave Evans and I started the Evans and Sutherland Company. And Dave was living in Salt Lake City. He was at the University of Utah, and I was at Harvard. And obviously, a high-tech company of that sort should be on Route 128 in the Boston area. I made this point to David, and he agreed. Now, Joy Evans had a different argument. And her argument was that the Evans family had 7 children, and the Sutherland family had 2. And consequently, I should move rather than they. And that's why the company was in Salt Lake. Yes?
As someone who is often considered the father of virtual reality, it seems you've been fairly reticent to talk about it. Why is that?
I've been reticent to talk about historical things in general. I mean, I've given 2 of this historical series talks, and that's virtually the only historical talks I've ever given. And my sense is that the interesting things to talk about are current work. And I like to devote my time and attention to the work that I'm doing now. And I like to give talks about the exciting things that are brand new now. It seems to me that there's a lot of folk who go around living in the past and say, oh, it was great back then, and, the world was new, and so on. And wasn't it wonderful, and so on. But yes, and what are you doing now? And I kind of don't like that. I much prefer to be involved and to be engaged and to think about today's problems. And the reason I've been giving a couple of these talks and doing a little of this is that there is a historical record, and there are people in this room who weren't born when this was done. And there's my grandchildren, okay, who need to see this tape at some point, who haven't heard this story, and at an appropriate point in their lives will need to hear this story. And so it's probably appropriate to do a little of the historical stuff. But believe me, I'm doing some real exciting stuff now, and I'd like to talk about that much more. Yes?
If you could go back in a time machine and give yourself some advice in 1962, what would that advice be?
Buy Intel. That's a tough question. That's a really tough question. I guess I've shared with a number of the folk that I work with some of my sense of the importance of balance. Turns out that computing stuff is very exciting. This is some of the most exciting and interesting stuff that exists. And I think I did okay in terms of time playing with my children, time taking off to look at the fall colors, and time just doing things that have to do with being human and living. And I guess my advice to me would be do more of that. I know too many people who reach my age and don't know who their kids are and don't know what a family is. And that's a hard place to be. And you've got to make that investment of time in the human side of being human. And computing is this very, very, it's like a drug. There's nothing more exciting than my program works. How many of you saw GoldenEye? Remember GoldenEye? Let's see hands. Who's seen GoldenEye? My favorite line of that is, "I am invincible," right? Do you remember? Hello, who was he? Igor? No. What was his name? Boris, the programmer, right? He'd bang away on his keyboard and he'd get his network thing to do his thing. I am invincible, right? And you could see he was just thoroughly engaged with this very fascinating object, the computer. Yes, Liz?
Comment on the importance of teaching. There are a few I know that spend more time sharing their information, their excitement, with others, and I know you have a real commitment to that, of bringing others along, and I'd just like to hear your comments on it.
Well, you know, there's really only one thing the older generation can give the younger generation, and that's knowledge and experience. There's nothing else that you can leave behind. And the wonderful thing about knowledge is you can give it away and then you got more of it. Turns out in teaching you learn what's there. There's so few things that if you give them away, you got more. Okay? It's hard to think of things of that sort. And teaching has that wonderful quality that both the teacher and the recipient get something out of it. That's fun. Let's have some questions for Bob, too. Bob, why don't you get up here? Don't hide back there. Come on. Come
I think you answered very well.
on. But I'm overworked here, Bob.
Mike.
I sort of asked you this question, but so you wrote something, so I guess towards the end of this, where you sort of said, well, these are the 10 unsolved problems of computer graphics. If you were to do that now, what would be on that list?
You go answer that.
Oh, no. No, actually, we were discussing this the other day. He wrote that actually just before this project. And in fact, I was wondering whether one of those problems, whether in fact Ivan was, prior to this, was at ARPA doing essentially research management. And I think actually, I don't know, maybe you'd like to comment, Ivan, but I think actually that can be a fairly stimulating job in the sense that you see a lot about what's going on. You may get stimulated to think about some things that aren't going on that you might like to be able to do, and so on. Anyway, toward the end of that period, this Datamation article came out with the 10 unsolved problems of computer graphics. We were going to actually try to look it up. My recollection is that one that was on it was something that was quite, not literally the virtual reality thing, but something that smacked a lot of it, that had many of those ingredients. So I was wondering whether Ivan, in fact, had pretty much sort of dreamt up this project, or pretty much the idea while he was at ARPA, but he doesn't seem to recall that. So,
Well, it was clear by the time I went to Harvard that the idea was there.
right.
Where ideas come from is often hard to know. I had been interested in extensions to the human capabilities, and there was a wonderful guy at the General Electric Laboratory in Schenectady. No, not in Schenectady. Where is there?
Schenectady?
Yeah. By the name of Frank Mosier. And Frank Mosier had built a thing called a pedipulator. And this was basically a walking truck. And it was driven by a driver who had a couple of handles and a couple of foot pedals, which moved the four legs of this truck. And it was quite nimble. He could kick over a bunch of logs and so on. It took quite a bit of training to learn to drive it, because you have to balance, and so on. And I had gone up to see this thing. It was really pretty fascinating. I went home and told my daughter about it. She was, I think, 5. And I said, I went to see the pedipulator. Do you know what a pedipulator is? And she said, sure, Daddy. It's a machine that goes pedip, 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 pedip. Mosier didn't think that was very funny.
So Ivan built his own pedipulator.
You mentioned the extension of human capability. What do you think about the likelihood of neural interfaces, embedded computing, and those kind of things?
Listen, I don't know. I have to say, I think that if you were asking about unsolved problems before, sort of what graphics is today, I think actually that this 10 years of graphics is going to all be about sensor data. What's really happening is the volume of data that you can get cheaply, accurately, efficiently is just going way, way up. And your ability to figure out what the hell to do with it or what it means, to some extent, is going up too, because a lot of that data collection you can do in a way that gives you higher signal to noise. Things like phased arrays of microphones, for example, or arrays of cameras that you do essentially synchronous detection on. Okay, so now you have these things, but how do what do you do with them now? How do you look at them? How do you figure out what's in that data? And so I actually think that graphics is much more about visualizing and seeing that data. And by the way, I mean, people often ask me about, how do you think, when do you think is graphics a success and so on? And my attitude is, no one ever asks whether disk drives are a success. We take them for granted. You can't build a computer system without them. And I actually think that the biggest measure of success of graphics in general is that you don't think of going out and buying a computer without a really capable graphic system on it. And it will only get more capable over time. And you will be able to take more and more for granted the routine application of algorithms such as these and lots fancier things, quite frankly, to help you understand what the hell's going on in some calculation you're doing or some problem of a medical or mechanical sort you're trying to diagnose, or goodness knows what. And we haven't begun, I think, to exploit the ability of using computers to make images that teach us things. It's still, as Ivan said, it's still cartoons. And in that sense, I think there's a lot more direction to go. I don't think is that building hardware? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But it's certainly giving a better coupling between models we build and manipulate in the computer or sense from the outside world and things we have to imagine or intuitively understand in our head, which is kind of what we got started, that's what Licklider was excited about. Licklider's idea was that somehow, and he also, I think, called it, well, his idea was that problem solving should be joint, that the computer should do what it was good at, and the human should do what he or she was good at, and that graphics was a good way to kind of offer the communication vehicle back and forth. And I think if you go back and look at that paper, you'll have to say that, and that thinking, that we haven't begun to solve all the problems or really sort of make good on the vision that Licklider had. We've made a good start. I'm sorry, we have begun, but there's a lot more to do. So. Yes?
Don't take this as a one-eyed question.
Oh, of course not.
On the PD1, there were sort of 10 or 12 of you sharing a personal computer for home instead of, you probably have 3 or something. And so, the way you did work and the way you shared was different. And there had to be some things that were lost. How can you do the same kind of sharing, or do you do the same kind of sharing today that you did in that group, where you all had to share one machine, and you knew other people's?
Well, I think, I was up today over at Stanford today, and even in their brand new big building, you walk up and down, you see the labs chocked a block with computers, and the students are actually sitting right next to each other, and their best source of information is the student next to them. And I don't think that's much different than what we had in the basement of Cruff. Namely, the people I learned from was the guy whose time was expiring when I came in at 2 o'clock in the morning, or who was taking over from me at 6. And looking at listings that were around and asking questions and so on and so forth. And I think that spirit is still around in education institutions today. So I don't think we've lost anything. As long as you don't sit at home and telecommute.
Gwen, I think there was something that was not it didn't appear on the PDB-1 so much, but time sharing did 2 things. One was it gave many people personal computer type access to a single machine. And the machine was too expensive to let one person use. A PDB-1 in those days ours was a big one, but the PDB-1 was a small machine. It was not a major item, so we could afford to use it as a single user thing. But the larger machines had to be multiple user. And as time sharing came to be, it provided that online access that people like. There were a fair number of experiments done to try and find out whether that was economic. Did in fact people get programs programmed faster with online access or not? They liked it better. But every experiment that was done demonstrated that good programmers could get programs to work independent of anything, and bad programmers couldn't. And how you moved people from one category to the other was a mystery. Still is, right? But the other thing that time sharing did was to provide a shared file system. And I think when the personal computer first came into use, as practiced principally at Apple, the people who did that didn't recognize the value of the shared file system. And they forgot that groups of people need to share information and need to share programs and share ideas. And the big thing I think that time sharing contributed was the knowledge that sharing was of great value. I think it's one of the strong points of Sun, is that Sun grew up from an environment in which the network was very important. And the notion that the information that you keyed into the machine, or whatever data went into the machine, was there. It wasn't squirreled away on some tape on some shelf where nobody could get at it. It wasn't in my house or your house or his house. It was on the net and available to all. And the exciting thing that's happening today with the growth of the network is that we're going to experience nationally, we're beginning to experience nationally, that same sharing of an enormous quantity of data. And it's the sharing between the human people, the human beings, that's so very valuable. So I don't know if that's the kind of direction you wanted to go, but we didn't experience that very much at the PDP-1. The PDP-1 was kind of like a single user, you know, you generally took your programs home on your paper tape or on your magnetic tape, and so it didn't have that property of sharing the data.
But I do recall a harbinger. One of the strange guys who came in and used the PDP-1 was somebody who came in with a soldering iron and wired up a strange kind of modem to it and went away, and periodically it would ring and the lights would come on, and you know, you'd wonder whether somebody was connecting. The guy who was experimenting with different ways of using communications by the name of Larry Roberts.
Like 1987, 88, 89, the ENS computer building over in Mountain View someplace not too far from here. What happened to that company and what lessons were?
The Evans and Sutherland Company is alive and well in Salt Lake City. It for a while had a branch here which was building a, I will say, medium-sized supercomputer. And that investment, that was a very interesting project. That was an investment in a potential future of a different sort for a company that was primarily a graphics company. And that investment stopped when Dave Evans stepped down as president of the company. Whether that should have happened or not is a subject of debate. But it's very interesting to me to note that when the company stopped making an investment that had the potential of tripling the size of the company, the stock price jumped. So that division of ENS was closed down, and the stock went up, which led me to the conclusion that the shareholders of publicly traded companies in the United States are not very interested in the long-term future of their company. And I've had something to say about this on a number of occasions. And it is the way we do business in the United States that new ideas get pursued by new organizations, and that those new organizations then grow into tomorrow's companies. And I'm quite comfortable predicting that in the year 2005, one of the major players in our industry will be a company that has yet to be formed. And several of the players in our industry who exist today won't be around. We've experienced some of that already. And there's a turmoil of new organizations that our system of capitalism forces on us for the reason that shareholders have no incentive whatsoever to hold shares longer than 1 microsecond. And so if Intel begins to not make profits, Intel stock will tank, and the shareholders of Intel will go and do something else. So the remarkable thing is that companies invest in the future at all, because the shareholders sure don't care. And of course you can always make the argument, but wait a minute, there are a few loyal shareholders who are there for the long term. But of course they aren't the ones who are trading, and so they're not the ones who are setting the stock prices. That whole experience was a very eye-opening experience to me. Yeah?
Does that same phenomenon apply to sponsored research, either by companies sponsoring research at a university or by the government sponsoring research with the taxpayers as the ultimate shareholders being equally short-sighted with respect to the government? Do you think projects like this are less likely to occur, you know, in this increasingly short-sighted environment, even at universities?
How big an advertisement should you take in the yellow pages of your phone book? If you look in the yellow pages of a phone book, you will find that different kinds of organizations take advertisements of different sizes. And some pages of the yellow pages, you'll find all the advertisements are that big. And some you'll find they're all full-page ads. And the answer, I think, is you should take an advertisement in the Yellow Pages as big as your competition is taking. How much money should the United States invest in research? And I think the answer is we need to invest as much in research as our economic competitors do. Because they have human beings who are just as smart as ours. They have access to the same literature that we do. And so their rate of economic development is controlled by the rate that they invest, and the relative rate is controlled by the relative investment. So my sense is that the important thing nationally is that as a nation we invest as much as our economic competitors. The scary thing is I wonder if we are. I don't believe we should count on the fact that American ingenuity is better than the ingenuity of folk in Europe or in Asia. I just don't believe that's true. Now, that being true, the question of what should we invest in the long term is, I think, an answerable question, but it takes careful economic study of what other folk are doing. And there's lots of places where we fail to invest in the long term as much as we should. Okay? California public schools, to pick an example close to home. But given that we do make some investments in the long term, there's a very great difference between federal investments and private corporation investment. Federal investments invest in people, teaching people how to do new things. And the federal government has a profit-sharing program in place with all of us. Okay, it's called income taxes. So the federal government put $10 million a year, roughly, into the University of Illinois. And one of the outgrowths of that research program at the University of Illinois is called Netscape. And Netscape has a market capitalization of what, $2 billion?
Not anymore.
What is it today? What is it today?
I don't know.
About $1 billion.
About $1 billion?
It
Okay.
lost half its market cap.
When that stock is sold, the feds will get their cut. And their cut of that street value, and their cut of the taxes that the folk who work there pay and so on, more than repays the investment that they put in. So just as a financial proposition, investment in high technology research nationally is a terrific investment. It makes jobs. Okay, it makes us competitive internationally. It makes balance of payments improvements, and so on. And unlike companies, if a company invests in the 10-year long term, the people that it teaches by doing that will probably go and roll their own. Won't work there. I mean, why should Corporation X pay for 10-year kind of research? It can't, because its turnover is faster than that. People turnover is faster than that. On the other hand, people tend to stay in the United States. And so when the federal government pays for research, puts money into research money, the people who do that research have a vested interest in making it valuable. And then it's valuable to the entire economy. I think that's a note I want to end on. Let's quit.